Well, thank you everybody for joining us on this fine evening, and we welcome Andy Hardy, G1AJH. I'm looking down here just to make sure I don't get it wrong. And at the end of this, you'll be able to ask questions. For everybody on YouTube watching this, then welcome. You'll see a chat window on one side. So put any questions that you have for Andy in the chat window, and we'll do our best to read them out for him. And make sure you have some really difficult questions, like how he went to the toilet and things like that, all that good stuff.
That's my
So,
favorite part of the whole journey.
oh yeah, yeah. So I've got my stick and rudder book. Why is this here? Hold on. There we are. So I've got my stick and rudder book, which I think is the best book in the world. It's completely inaccurate of how you fly. I've got my my fuel tester
Good man.
ready. So over to you, Andy. You have control and chocks away.
All right, here we go. Just got to share my screen first. Can you let me know if you can see my screen?
Yep.
That's awesome. And now I can no longer see all of you, but that's okay. All right, well, good evening, everybody. So my name's Andy Hardy. You can probably tell from my accent that I'm Australian, but I've lived here for 31 years. Recently moved from the home counties area down here to Dorset, where I'm currently based. I do have a British radio call sign, ham radio call sign, Golf 1 Alpha Juliet Hotel, which I recently converted from my Australian license. I've sort of been dormant on the radio for about 3 decades. And then having moved down here, we've got a bit of space in the garden. So I've just put a concrete base in and put the antenna up, and hope to get on the air next weekend, actually. Formerly VK2CHA, because I first got my license when I was about 17 years old back in Sydney, where I grew up. Anyway, what I wanted to talk to you about today was a flight that I did in my little aeroplane, which is a type of aeroplane called a Piper Cherokee, to Australia from London to Sydney. And I did that back in 2013 with my good friend Sam Kidd. He's on the left there. He couldn't join us tonight. But Sam was a neighbour's kid in Buckinghamshire, where I used to live. 13 years old, his mum brought him round and said he wanted to come flying with me. So we taught him how to fly, eventually taught him how to sell stuff. And he's one of my sales guys in my team today. We've worked together for the last dozen or so years now. But back at this stage, I was running a part of Dell here in Europe, and I was able to negotiate taking a few months off. And because Sam worked for me, got him to take a few months off as well, because I'll get into it in a minute with the flight to Australia. But for me, it was a midlife crisis that I was excited to do, to raise some money for charity. And fulfill an ambition I always had to get back home to Australia under my own steam. For Sam, as a young guy, it was just a great opportunity for him to do a really unique journey. And I don't have an autopilot, and so you need someone else with you, because it's an awfully long way sometimes that we have to fly 8, 9, 10 hours a day. And no automation, no autopilot. So it's a lot smarter to have 2 people. So that's why you see 2 of us on the screen there. That was in the middle of the Northern Territory, in the middle of nowhere. We'd had a bit of trouble that day with a fuel tank, actually. So we had to land in the middle of nowhere and sort that out. So it's great to be able to present to you guys tonight. I understand you are the Berry and Warrington Radio Societies, but I've just added in Werribee as well there, because of my mate Ian down there in Werribee. So I gather this is also the Werribee Radio Society. So I'll just check, Lyndon, can you hear me okay, and shall I continue?
Yeah, I can hear you fine.
Rock and roll. Okay. Well, what I thought I'd cover for you is really in 3 sections this evening, and I hope it's of interest. This is a presentation that I usually do for flying clubs. And I'm going to talk first a little bit about an overview of the trip and why we did it, and what some of the planning considerations were, the route we took, etc. That's the first part. I'm then going to talk about the radio side of it, the HF in particular, because it's not usual here in Europe, excuse me, to have HF in your aircraft. And I've sort of added a little bit more in there about some of the other avionics equipment. I'm curious to know, maybe show of hands, but Lyndon, bear in mind, I can't see anyone. So are there any other pilots on the call this evening? Does it look like there is? Was that a yes?
Trainee pilot. Flight Sim fly?
Oh, I couldn't quite make that out. What's the answer?
I'm a trainee pilot.
Trainee pilot, fantastic. All right, good. Well,
yeah, I've got a PPL with night rating.
Awesome. Well, I got a PPL and night rating and instant rating, and a HF FRTOL as well, which I'll get into in a minute. So anyone else that's also a pilot, please feel free to chip in or even ask questions around the aviation side of things. But because you guys are a radio club, I have done this once before for another amateur radio society. So I've added some stuff in about the radios, which I hope is interesting. And please feel free to ask questions about any of that stuff as we go through. So why did we do it? Why on earth would you get in a single engine, 4-seat, petrol-driven piston engine aircraft and fly halfway around the world? Well, I think a big part of that was I just wanted to get myself home under my own steam. One day I was flying across the channel and actually had on board some World War II veterans as part of that Project Propeller, if you're familiar with that at all. And one of them said to me, how far can you go? I said, well, I could keep going as far as I wanted to, really. He said, could you fly all the way home to Australia? And I got thinking, yeah, I reckon I could. And I sort of wanted to show that a couple of weekend pilots, we're not the sort of guys that, fly airliners and spend all of our life doing this. And we also don't have the kind of aircraft that's equipped for doing this. We have what's called an SEP, or a single engine piston aircraft, could fly halfway around the world to Australia. And we did, and it was great fun. And this is a little about the story of that. But we also did it in order to raise money for Oxfam, a charity that means a lot to me. We found, obviously, in this age of the internet, that we could easily attract a fair bit of publicity as we did this, and not just TV and radio and stuff, but we also managed to get quite a following on Facebook, Twitter, etc. going. And so once we understood that we had the ability to gain interest in what we were doing through the year of preparation and the 2 months of the journey, we thought, well, let's leverage that to raise some money for Oxfam. And we were very pleased at the support we got. We raised about $25,000. What's that in pounds? Can't do it in my head. For Oxfam at the time, which we're very pleased with. Because if you don't do something like that, you're just burning a very expensive hole in the sky. And we thought that would be a good outcome if we could do that, as well as live out my midlife crisis. So some of the planning considerations, some of the pilots in the room might be familiar with some of this, but some of this is really only applicable if you've got an ATPL, an air transport pilot's license, which I don't. So, like I say, I have a private pilot's license. Ordinarily, you might not be concerned about things like the ITCZ. ITCZ is a meteorological term. It means the Intertropical Convergence Zone. And that basically describes where the world's northern hemisphere and southern hemisphere weather systems bump into each other. And that creates quite a lot of heavy weather in the tropics. You'll all be familiar if you've traveled to the tropics. There's quite often a lot of thunderstorms, etc. And we certainly had our share of those. In fact, the ITCZ also generates weather systems like the monsoon, the northwest monsoon in India, and also the big wet in the north end of Australia, as they call it. And we sort of had to time our trip so that we could avoid the worst of the monsoon and yet get to Australia before the big wet set in, which we almost managed until we hit a big thunderstorm at Darwin. But there you go. We'll tell you more about that later. The other big planning consideration was fuel. Aircraft of the sort that I fly, single engine piston aircraft, use a type of aviation fuel known as avgas. It's gasoline like you'd use in a petrol engine car, with modifications so that it doesn't pre-detonate at altitude and things like that. And avgas used to be available everywhere in the world, but it's available in less and less places. So we had to make arrangements to have avgas, and pretty much where we stopped was determined by where we could or couldn't get avgas. And I think we might be some of the last people to do this trip using that conventional form of fuel, because it's just getting very hard to get. Whereas Jet A, as we call it, Jet A1 fuel, that the turbine engine aircraft use, that's pretty much everywhere these days. We had to install some equipment so that we could measure the fuel flow and get up to speed with those planning calculations so that we could understand really how much fuel we had and what our options were if we couldn't land at our chosen destination, etc. One of the most challenging parts of the whole process is actually bureaucratic. Once you get away from Europe, Australia, North America, and some civilized parts of the Southeast Asian part of the world, you mostly find that you can't just fly where you want to without asking someone. And in fact, you need formal written permission from quite a lot of countries in order to fly over their territory. And they'll have restrictions, like you'll need to follow airways that the airliners follow, even if you're beneath them. You can't just fly anywhere that you want to in their airspace. It's a very complex process. Sometimes it involves having someone physically join a queue in somewhere like Karachi or somewhere like that to get you your overflight permission, a little chit of paper. And they'll have restrictions also around what date, what time you can and can't. And then, of course, as your plans change, that all has to get revised. So we used a great bunch of fellows out of Cairo called GASE, General Aviation Support Egypt, actually run by a British expat called Eddie Gold, fantastic fellow, if any of you have come across him. And they handled all of that for us. I cannot say enough about their role in helping us get this done. The aircraft itself, like I touched on before, we had to add in fuel flow measurement. Typically, as a pilot of a light aircraft, you use your watch, and you've got an average fuel burn of 10 gallons an hour or whatever it might be. But we needed a much higher level of accuracy to make sure that we weren't going to inadvertently run out of fuel if we had to divert or something of that sort. We had to install HF communications. I'll go into some detail about that in a moment, but essentially, when you're flying under instrument flight rules, as I said, we had to follow airways in a lot of these jurisdictions. You have to remain in permanent communication with ATC, and you're very often out of VHF range. We don't fly as high as the airliners, so we're about 10,000 feet, whereas airliners are at 30,000, 40,000 feet. So there are situations where you can have the airliners relay your message for you because they've got more range because of the altitude. But even with that, you still run into situations where you just can't maintain comms, and so you need HF. You have to get a particular license for that, an endorsement on your license for that, the way the rules work. We also had to have a ferry tank installed. We took out the two back seats. We had some specialists in Denmark install a big rubber bag that holds more fuel than the wings normally hold. And that took our flight range in terms of flight time from about 4.5 hours to about 12 hours that we could potentially keep flying for if we absolutely had to. That complicated our performance, aircraft performance though, because it meant that we were routinely about 12% overweight over the standard weight, which is permitted for ferry flying. And that meant that we had to be very, very careful with our calculations about runway length and temperature and density of the air in order to get off some of those runways, especially in hot places like through the Middle East. We've put a lot of time into getting ourselves ready. It's one thing to fly around on instruments here in Europe where you've got air traffic services laid on and all the instrument landing systems handy where you need them, etc. It's a little bit different when you're out in the middle of nowhere and got to be a bit more reliant on yourself and relatively few of those services. So we did a lot of preparation and practice with a good mate of mine who's a Qantas pilot who came over and put some time in with us for that. He'd done a number of ferry flights of warbirds back to Australia and was able to help us tremendously with that. That was my good friend Ross Kelly, who's unfortunately since died in an aircraft accident, but hats off to you, Ross, because we couldn't have done this without you. We had to get all the right aviation charts. Well, these days, happily, that's available in electronic form. Otherwise, we'd have had more paper than we could have fitted in the cockpit. And I'll show you some screenshots of some of that stuff as we go through. There are all sorts of calculations that airline pilots have to do that we normally don't when flying around Europe here. Things like point of no return when you're flying over oceans and deserts. So we had to bone up on that stuff. And as Lyndon alluded to earlier, we did have to take special care of our personal plumbing in order that we could sit there for 9-10 hours a day and do so without the chance of a bathroom break. I'm getting on for 60 years of age now, so some of the members of the audience will be older than me. You'll know that you do need to can take into account less bladder range than when you're a bit younger, perhaps. Any questions before I plow on? I'm just very conscious that I I haven't got my screen set up so as I can see everyone's face. So I don't know if I'm coming across all right or if there's anyone trying to ask me a question at the moment, Lyndon, or shall I just plow on?
Kristen, yes, everything's fine. Carry on.
Or hang on, I can see a question in the chat from Neil, November 9, November Lima. I'm intrigued by the notion that avgas is hard to find. Is hobby aviation going away worldwide? Neil, it sounds like you're in the States with your call sign. And yeah, hobby aviation, as you know it in the States, you'd be familiar with in Australia as well. It's widely available. But in most of the world, it is not so easy to fly. It is about twice the cost here in Europe than it is in the US. That's partly to do with the duties on avgas. It's also to do with the cost of maintenance outside of the US, because we're much more heavily regulated here in Europe. And yeah, the bits in between, yeah, hobby aviation has never really been anything like it is in the States or over here. I hope that answers your question, Neil. And I have also brought the chat window up now, just in the Zoom chat window. So if anyone else wants to type in a question, I will get there. Okay, Neil, you're welcome. Righto, so this is what we did in terms of our route. So on the 20th of July back in 2013, we'd moved the aircraft up to Denmark, where those specialists put in the ferry tank for us. And then we left it there with them over the summer. And we'd arranged, because of the monsoon, we'd arranged to use the last quarter of the year for our journey. So we left there, we took off on our journey just at the very end of September. And we got to Sydney, Bankstown Aerodrome in Sydney. That's the YSBK ICAO code at the bottom right of the screen there. We got there 7 weeks and 2 days later, on the 18th of November. We flew on average about half the time. You sort of need time to be able to rest and recuperate. And typically, because we're all hand flying, fatigue is a big issue. So we typically flew 2 or 3 days on the trot, then we had 2 or 3 days off. Quite a lot of the time we would have to use that time to do various maintenance tasks. Every 50 hours, you have to clean the filters and change the plugs and all that sort of stuff. We did about 140 hours of total flying time, and we did a couple of those 50-hour services en route. Oh, now Steve's asked a good question there. Mike Zero, Mike Oscar India, g'day to you. How does a Great Circle route compare to the one you took? Well, a Great Circle route would have been about 4,000 miles shorter than the route that we took. The big challenge in our aircraft, Steve, is that the high ground we just can't get over. We can get up to about 10,000 feet. And frankly, it would take us half the morning to get up to 10,000 feet when we were overweight and it was hot weather and stuff like that, because the air's a lot thinner. And we've only got a piston engine in the aircraft, normally aspirated, no turbo or anything. So once we get up to 10,000 feet, we can cruise very happily, but we can't really climb easily above that. Maybe up to 11 or 12,000 feet in a pinch, but we couldn't sustain that. So that means you can't go across the Himalayas. That means you can't go across the high ground in Turkey, for example. Certainly can't go across the Alps. So the Great Circle route would have been right down the middle of this globe here, like across Central Asia. But that really wasn't a choice for us. Good question. Thanks for that. I really appreciate the questions coming in, by the way. So do let me know if you got more. How do we navigate? Well, fundamentally, it's with a compass. But we do have to follow airways, and Jeppesen, which is a well-known global supplier of aviation charts, kindly donated us access to their electronic charts that we accessed on the iPad. That screenshot on the left is us flying down a particular airway in the middle of the Persian Gulf. We are the purple dot there. We'd have been at probably 9,000 or 10,000 feet at that point. This is the border of the Iranian airspace. We were a little bit cautious of that because at the time our insurers had told us that if we'd crossed that line, all bets were off on our insurance. So we didn't want that. So if you can visualize where we are, this is Bahrain. We're just coming down the middle of the Gulf. Abu Dhabi would be at the bottom of the screen. We're actually on our way to Dubai from Riyadh at that point. And we're slightly miffed that the air traffic controllers had put us out in the middle of the Persian Gulf. I'd have liked to have been a little bit closer to the shoreline at that point, but you don't get to choose. You just got to follow the airways. And frankly, we're just happy that they kept us out of the way of the airliners as well, to be honest with you. We had some other software that's used for what we call VFR, visual flight rules, as opposed to the IFR, instrument flight rules, when you're following the airways. And we used a British product actually called Sky Demon, which doesn't have coverage outside of Europe, but they were just trialing some coverage for Australia at the time. So they gave us that version of their product. And one of the great things about Sky Demon, it's much more suited for flying visually, as I say. And one of the things it can tell you is your glide range. That blue circle around us there was our glide range. And at this point, we're somewhere in the middle of the Northern Territory here, near Catherine in the Northern Territory. And we actually had a bit of engine trouble. This was just some foul plugs. The engine was running a bit rough, and we were at, what are we at there, 9,500 feet, that says. And this was the moment that we knew that we could have glided if we had to that station there. That would be a little airstrip on a cattle station out there. So that was what we call the blue ring of confidence. We quite like that. Now, Tristan saying the letters are the call signs of the airports in a way. Yeah, that's true. They're not the actual radio call signs. The letters, if I just go back to that previous one for you, things like if I take, for example, Oscar Papa Kilo Charlie there, well, Oscar would be that region of the world. Papa is Pakistan. Kilo Charlie is Karachi. So thanks for that question, Tristan. But we actually use, like, hello Karachi in terms of the radio call signs, Karachi radar, Karachi ground, or whatever it might be. All right. James asked a question. What kind of restrictions did you have in terms of flying over the water and maximum distance from airports? James, that is an awesome question. The longest part of my time went into trying to minimize my time over hostile terrain, whether that was oceans or whether that was deserts or a mountainous terrain, for example, particularly over the Burmese border area. But you can't avoid it, so you have to just minimize the risks. And in terms of legal restrictions, well, there are none other than that Iranian airspace. It's sort of up to us. But we took raft. We wore immersion suits. You'll see some pictures of all that in a minute. Which is a lot of precautions with personal locator beacons. The main risk, of course, is of ditching would be an engine failure, but far more likely is that due to weather or other navigation challenges that you just can't make it to the other shore. We did have an engine fail briefly. It recovered in the middle of the Timor Sea, and I'll tell you a bit more about that later on. That's the bit between Indonesia and Australia, actually. But in terms of restrictions, it's just what the aircraft will do, and frankly, what your balls will enable you to do, if I can be so blunt. There we go. Does that answer your question, James? Just ping yes or no on the question box there, and I'll be happy to see if I can clarify. No worries. All right. Okay, so that's part one. Let's move into part two, which means I get to have a sip of my wine. So hang on a sec. Cheers, everyone. So there's this section I'm going to talk about the radios in general. So there's a need for high frequency, shortwave, as many people know, air traffic control services. In small airplanes like mine, most flying is done under what we call VFR, visual flight rules. And speaking with the air traffic services is optional in that case. I could fly from here to Glasgow, here in the South Coast, all the way to actually to Land's End to John O'Groats if I wanted to, and I wouldn't have to speak to anyone if I didn't want to. It's often smarter to speak to someone because you can get all sorts of useful information or services from them. You don't have to. But when you're flying, excuse me, when you're flying IFR under instrument flight rules and under airways in particular, the pilot is obliged to maintain comms with ATC at all times. And beyond line of sight, as you'll all know, because you're all radio people, and in remote areas, oceanic airspace, VHF quickly becomes useless, other than relaying via the airliners, which we did quite a lot. The airliners monitor by law the guard frequencies of 121.5, 243 megahertz. You can always call someone on those, and then quickly change to what we call the numbers, which is 123.45 in the airband, all AM, all amplitude modulated. So we could often have a chat with someone and ask if they could relay a message to Karachi or somewhere for us. but that's not always possible, and it's not always what's required by ATC either. When you get your pilot's license in this country, you also get an FRTOL, a Flight RT Operator's License, which is what permits you to transmit and receive, in fact, on all of the airband frequencies. But it allows VHF only. I had to get a HF endorsement on my FRTOL. Anyone with a ham radio license could do this easily. It's like, what is SSB and what is the F layer for Skywave and things of that sort. What is cell call, etc. But the bloke who did my my HF radio test, one of the radio examiners from the CAA, the day that I did it back in 2013, he told me that no one else had asked him for one of those in about 12 years. So I think there's not a lot of call for HF endorsements out here anyway. So how is HF organised in the aviation world? Well, unlike what we do in ham radio, you can't just pick a frequency and call CQ and hope you're going to contact someone. So what will typically happen is, as you're approaching the boundary of the VHF range, usually the controller will have an idea as to when they're going to lose you. They will then give you onwards frequencies. And sometimes this happens just with VHF, and they'll say, call us on this frequency, or this frequency, when you get 50 miles from wherever they tell you, and try to make contact with us. But if you're going into oceanic or remote area airspace, they'll give you a primary and a secondary HF frequency. It's always expected to be USB, and those frequencies come from an ICAO sort of organized group called MWARA. That's the major world air route area frequencies. And in some parts of the world, like notably in Australia, there's also regional domestic air route areas which have their own discrete HF frequencies. So this shows you all the ones in the world, so that's all a bit confusing. But if I just zoom up on it a little bit, here's the MWARA frequencies for this particular SEA, Southeast Asia region. And this was one of the areas where I just had to use the HF. In particular, when I was tracking from Bali, you can see Bali on the chart there, over to this part of the Indonesian archipelago, which is West Timor, to a city called Kupang, and also in the oceanic airspace here between Kupang and Darwin. So we really had to have HF there. And the frequencies we had to use were from that block of SEA3. I think on the day they gave me 6556 and 3470 and said, call us on one, and if you don't hear us on that, call us on the other. And that's the way it works. So I'm hoping that makes some kind of sense to people. Is this stuff of interest to you guys? I don't know if it is, but anyway, I did that with basically a regular icon that I've got installed in the aircraft. I'll show you pictures of that in a minute. I just had it modified so that I could transmit on any frequency that I chose. As I mentioned, once you get into the Australian leg of the journey, Air Services Australia, which is a bit like the CAA, they have their own HF operations, because unlike here in Europe, in Australia, it's pretty commonplace to need to use HF because there's lots of the country that's out of VHF range of the major coastal cities or even some of the inland towns. So the Flight Information Services guy will offer you the primary and the secondary frequency as you travel through there. So I first made contact with what's called Brisbane Radio, somewhere out here in the Timor Sea. And then later on in the middle of the Bundoon out here in Alice Springs. You're basically always talking to Brisbane Radio or Brisbane International. That's just because the control facility for all the HF happens to be in Brisbane. And they've got these 6 HF areas, and honestly, you just if one frequency doesn't work, you just try another one or another one or another one, and you seem to eventually get through to someone, which is great. So there's another use of HF, which we do use here in Europe. And because I've still got the ICOM 706 in the aircraft, I sometimes tune this up when I'm flying around just for fun, actually. And that's VolMet. So VolMet, obviously French, vol is flight and met is meteorology, is the weather. So it's a way that you can find out the weather basically anywhere, just flying along autonomously. And what they broadcast is a series of codified transmissions that are very well understood by pilots, because we use them all the time in written form anyway for forecast and terminal weather. And that's what we call a TAF. A TAF stands for Terminal Aerodrome Forecast. A METAR, which is Met Actual Report, so that's the current weather at a given airfield, and what's called a SIGMET, that's a significant weather report, typically a warning of some sort. Alan's asked, did I have cell call on the ICOM? No. I practiced making the tones like beep, boop, but no, it didn't work. And you don't have to have cell call on the routes that I flew happily, because that would have been a challenge. I'd have needed more equipment than I had room for that. Anyway, back to the Volmet. So on HF, these reports are broadcast via an automated transmission system, USB J3E, as I'm sure we all know. And they basically rotate through a whole bunch of, like they'll do, if I pick the Shannon Volmet on 5505, for example, you could tune it up now, any of you, you'd almost certainly hear it. Then it'll rotate through Paris, then Amsterdam, then Stockholm, then Dublin, et cetera, et cetera. I quite like listening to this sort of thing. If you, I'll just play you a sample of it. This is the TAF and METAR for Paris Orly one night when I was putting this together. So hang on.
Orly, valid from the 18th at 1800 until the 19th at 2400. Wind variable 3 knots. Tab OK. Tempo from 0100 until 0700. Visibility 3,500 meters. Shallow fog. Becoming between 0900 and 1100. Wind 160 degrees, 10 knots. Net reports. Paris Charles de Gaulle. Net report. Paris Charles de Gaulle at 2200 Zulu. Wind 070 degrees, 4 knots. Tab OK. Temperature minus. Viewpoint 7. QNH 1024, low sig.
So I'll stop it there. So what they're basically telling us in the forecast is, watch out, it's going to get colder and foggier in Paris. So if you're on the way there, you better hurry up, because right now the visibility is good, but it is a bit chilly and the wind is very light from the east, 070 at 4 knots. And, when you're trying to make decisions about whether to continue your flight or turn back or go to an alternate or whatever, that information is pretty useful. My American friend with the November call sign earlier would be aware that in the US, you can get all that information in the cockpit pretty easily via the satellite data transmission services. We don't really have that here in the UK. We're starting to get patchy coverage on certain systems, but that's not widely available here as it is in the States. And someone's asked, is that a bit like Navtex for sailors? Well, there is a text version of all this, but it's pretty hard to get in most cockpits of a light aircraft, though. Airliners do have access to that data via text getting uploaded to them. So yeah, good questions there. Okay, so that's Volmet. Oh, Lee, Golf 0 Alpha Mike uniform, also with the exotic 9 Hotel 3 Kilo Yankee call sign there. Says, I presume you used a wire antenna for HF, limited by the size of your aircraft. Well, that's a pretty sound assumption, actually, mate. And I'll be showing you some pictures of that in a minute. So, yeah, good question indeed. So I'll answer that properly for you in a second. So here we go. So here's the equipment that's installed in the aircraft. I would imagine most of you are pretty familiar with Mr. ICOM's 706. And there's a little mod you can do to those so that you can transmit on any frequency. The beauty of this thing, for me, was really regulatory. If you permanently install something in an aircraft as part of its normal avionics fit, then you've got to go through all sorts of bureaucratic hoops with our European EASA regulations to certify that. However, if you put it on its own separate power circuit, that's that little kill switch underneath there, the little toggle switch there. And if you have this head unit just velcroed onto your panel. It's not installed according to that legislation. And then obviously the remote unit's in the back, and I've got an SG237ATU in there. And there's the wire antenna going off there. It's an end-fed, kind of like an inverted phi long wire that goes from the middle of the fuselage up to the tail and out to the wing. I'll show you a picture of that in a minute. And that's me there listening to the Shannon Volmet frequency that I just was playing for you. And what I did in practice, because it is fiddly to fly in, especially in bad weather and no autopilot, at the same time as tune frequencies, is wherever I could, I loaded up those MWARA frequencies into the memories on the IC706 so that I could basically hunt around through them while I was in the air. Not using my UK call sign, but using my Australian call sign, I was able to also use the ham frequencies while I was aviation mobile or airborne mobile, whatever the right word is. Not allowed to do that with your G call sign. Beyond me why that would even be a rule, but it apparently is here in this country. But on this actual trip to Australia, I had lots of fun in the middle of India, for example, talking to JAs up in Tokyo. One bloke who'd recently retired from air traffic control was very excited to speak to me as his first aviation mobile contact. I think that was on 20 meters. So that was all done with this kit here. A couple of questions there. So no parts of DO-160. I don't know what DO-160 is, Vincent, and if you work for the CAA, I think I don't want to know, so you can probably type in what DO-160 is for me in a minute. And what was your typical speed through the air? This aircraft cruises at 130 miles per hour. It's actually certified and calibrated in imperial miles per hour. That's about 112, I think, knots is the airspeed. To answer Steve's question there. So I hope that's helpful. Vincent, do you want to tell me what DO-160 is about? If you do, type it in. Otherwise, I'll just move on to the next slide there. Where were we? So this is the antenna. So here it is. It comes. This is my aircraft. Golf Alpha Tango Yankee Sierra is its registration. So when flying, that's your call sign. Golf Yankee Sierra. We would typically abbreviate that too. Here's one leg of the long wire inverted V wire. I'm not sure what to call this. And it goes up to the tail, and then from the tail it comes down to this insulator here. Above it is a different antenna. That's the ADF Sense antenna coming above it here up to the nose, or to the just above the cockpit. And then anyway, the HF antenna then goes down to this insulator post here, so it can get through the skin of the aircraft, and obviously then back in down here on this white line here back to the SG237ATU. The orange box next to it there, that's a completely different thing. That's the EPIRB, which broadcasts the distress and your GPS location in the event of a crash, is what that is. That's a different box of tricks. So it's essentially a random length in V configuration. It works surprisingly well. I was able to operate portable parked up at Popham Airfield recently on the ground using my G1 call sign, and I had a bit of a chat with a I think it was Hotel Bravo 9 something or other the other day. So that's not much of an antenna, pretty low to the ground, but it's amazing what you can do when the conditions are right. One day I'd like to see Golf 1 Alpha Juliet Hotel operating aeronautical mobile, but I'm not sure that's going to be within the rules here, so I guess we'll have to wait on that one. There is all sorts of other avionics in a light aircraft these days. Some of it dates back to the 30s and 40s. That's stuff like the ADF, automatic direction finding equipment. That's this dial down here. That just literally points in the direction of the beacon, which is a low frequency beacon. Some of you might be familiar with LF beacons. For example, the Woodley beacon near Reading is, I think, 352 kilohertz, for example. And they just transmit a carrier. And on the continent, they're keyed with their Morse identity, so you need to use a BFO to hear them. Here in the UK and in Australia and the US and a lot of other places, they are modulated with a CW ident. And there's typically a 3-letter CW ident that's done in extremely slow Morse. So pilots don't really have to know the Morse code at any speed that would identify that. So at Woodley in Reading, it's Whiskey Oscar Delta, for example. I've got a primary NavCom system. So VHF AM for ATC, VHF, what we call a VOR, VHF omnidirectional range. That's this equipment here. I can select a radial from a ground station and it will show me where I am relative to that radial. That's extremely useful for navigation and especially for instrument landings. Uses the same receiver for that. I've got a question there from Neil, November 9, November Lima. Are there any real or regulatory issues about EMC or other problems with the use of non-avionics grade HF radio? Regulatory wise, that's really why you do it as ancillary equipment rather than built-in equipment. But every year, Neil, on what's called the annual inspection of the aircraft, a radio inspector, in addition to the mechanical inspections, does actually have to go through and make sure that there's no issues around operation of all the equipment and interoperation of all the equipment. So for sure, we're very heavily regulated in aviation because on the whole, governments don't want airplanes dropping out of the sky onto people's houses and killing civilians. So yes, all of that stuff is quite heavily tested. And you can bet your life, Neil, that as important as it is to the government, it's even more important to me. So what we did before we flew to Australia with the HF installation is we did a whole bunch of flying around actually in Denmark when we had all the pump systems in for the fuel tank as well. We spent a couple of days flying around doing flight tests and comm tests with a ham radio colleague up in Denmark as well. And we operated all the various avionics systems because it's not enough for me just to have a certificate from someone. I want to know that the stuff works before I put myself in peril. Thanks. It looks like I've answered your question, Neil. And Vincent's telling us that a DO160 is a standard for environmental testing of avionics posed by the RTCA. Well, I didn't have to comply with that for the add-on equipment, just like you don't have to if you have a GPS stuck on your windscreen. That's only for stuff which gets installed by an avionic engineer as part of the aircraft system. So that didn't apply to the ICOM in this case, mate. And it still flies around with me in the aircraft to this day. So I hope that's useful feedback for you, Vincent. Again, if you are a radio inspector or from the CAA, I'm going to have to change my name and move house, I think. So thanks for your question, mate. Appreciate it. I'll go back to the slides now. So I touched on the instrument landing system. It uses UHF for glide path information, so we know where we are when we're landing on instruments with respect to the particular glide slope of the particular airfield. Steve thinks I cheated by using GPS. Steve, you're giving away the fact that you're a student pilot. It is truly only student pilots that fly around the old way using a whiz wheel. Trust me on that, mate. Anyway, back to the slides. We've also got things we call a marker beacon that uses near enough 4 meters to tell you on some very old, almost phased out instrument landing systems how far you are from the missed approach point by making a sort of beep beep noise that gets ever higher in pitch as you get closer to the missed approach point on the approach. We've also got DME equipment, distance measuring equipment, which determines the slant range in nautical miles to ground-based transponders. That's a microwave type frequency, low microwaves, so just around 1 gig. You'll all be familiar, I imagine, with SSR, secondary surveillance radar transponders that use mode C. These days, mode S I have, which gives the air traffic controllers not just a blip on their screen, but also a code, a 4-digit octal code that they'll often get you to type in. And these days, mode S also gives additional information such as your call sign that they can see on their screens if they're so equipped. And then there's also a separate piece of equipment I've got, which is very widely available now. The CAA is subsidising installation of these devices. They're only about 500 quid, which is called electronic conspicuity. And that uses the extended squitter packets of the SSR Mode S data packets to broadcast your GPS position. And that's become increasingly important in our crowded skies so that one aircraft like mine can have half an idea if there's someone else converging on his track. So any questions about the avionics installed in the aircraft? Because that's about it for the radio section. The rest of it's going to be some pictures and stories of the journey itself. Anyone that doesn't want to type want to unmute and ask a question, or any questions on the YouTube, Lyndon, or shall I just plow on?
Yeah, it's all good on YouTube.
All right, mate. In that case, I shall plow on. Appreciate the questions, everyone. So this is us. Back to the actual flying. We had a whale of a time. That's Sam on the left. The snow-covered mountains behind him is just on the edge of Croatia, just before you hit the Adriatic there. We just crossed from, we'd come from Vienna to Zagreb, and we were just now going to go down the Adriatic coast. That's me. I know it looks like I've had a line of speed or something. I trust you I hadn't. I was just very happy to be there, and I'm not sure what explains the beard at that point. And you can see that we're wearing our immersion suits and our survival equipment, and that's my the little yellow thing there. That's not been tested for EMC either. Sorry, EMI either. That's a personal locator beacon. Again, it's just a GPS signal that gets transmitted up to a satellite if you're bouncing around in the ocean. So that was, we felt like we were properly on our way at that point as we headed down to the Greek islands. Our first stop, once we left the continent, was actually one of the Greek islands, Corfu. This is the view that we had at that moment, which maybe explains why we were looking a bit excited there. Oh, by the way, the headphones we're wearing are Bose noise-cancelling headphones, and they have connection to our stereo as well. So we were, at all times that we weren't talking to ATC, listening to some very heavy metal music, typically Rammstein or System of a Down, something of that order, which might also explain the looks on our faces. James says, oh, Tristan, I'm sorry, Tristan, did I get your name wrong? James says that that gear doesn't look comfortable. Yeah, it's not really comfortable at all. Dave Roberts, was there any disputes on the playlist? Okay, you've asked, so now I'm going to tell you. So Sam, despite growing up in Buckinghamshire, bizarrely, he likes country and Western music. I much more prefer Australian rock music of the 80s, of which I have a fairly broad knowledge. Happily, we both like heavy metal music. So we arranged the playlist before we went. We had an iPod full of stuff, and it was about 60% heavy metal and the occasional bit of country and Western. Garth Brooks, I think, springs to mind, and the occasional bit of Australian rock music from the 80s. So good question there. There was the occasional dispute, and I do remember once unplugging and looking out the window until some country Western singer had stopped droning on. Yeah, thanks for your sympathy vote there, Dave. I appreciate it. Yeah, so there we were chugging off down the Adriatic coastline, heading towards Split at this point, I think. And at the end of that day, we landed at Corfu. Now, Sam, when he was younger, spent a lot of time with family in Corfu, and he's got some family out there. He'd stay out there quite a lot. And if any of you have been to Corfu, you'll know that at that end of the runway, where I'm pointing on the right there, there's a causeway. And a lot of young kids, and Sam certainly would have been one of them when he was younger, will hang out there with their little notebooks while the holiday jets scream over them only a dozen or so feet above their heads with their wheels down and land on that runway. Well, Sam has landed at Corfu using his flight simulator hundreds of times before this day. So on this day, it was Sam's turn to fly the plane, and he got to fulfill his goal of landing at Corfu for real, which was pretty awesome. And you can see the look on Sam's face at that moment. He was pretty chuffed with that. We then stayed with family in Corfu and got drunk for a few days. It was quite good fun. And then we continued our journey down through the Greek islands and across Egypt, which was a bit of a challenge. And then eventually through Saudi, and after a bit of a stop in Jordan and Corfu on the way as well. Cyprus, I want to say as well. But over Saudi Arabia, I was just mesmerized with these views of the Saudi desert. It reminded me so much of the deserts back home in Australia, I can't tell you. That line there in the sand, by the way, that's not a road, that's a pipeline, I think, at that point. And then we landed in Riyadh just in time for the sunset. And that was, that was a pretty hair-raising moment, I have to say. It was just beautiful. You can't go as a tourist to Saudi. That's starting to change now, but certainly at that time you couldn't. but I had some business connections down there, and we managed to organise things such that we were able to stop there. This was us in Dubai. We had the great fortune to land in Dubai during Ramadan, and a lot of people during Ramadan like to do charitable things and support charities. And happily for us, our friends at ExecuJet, who I'd made through some connections at Dell when I was working out in the Middle East, decided that it would be very good, because we were supporting a charity called Oxfam, for them to take care of our landing fees in Dubai. I think that saved us $1,000 or so, and to do our 50 hours maintenance for us, which was just fantastic. These two boys standing either side of Sam, they're security guards. Now, I have to tell you, the day that we turned up, they weren't smiling with us, because we were sharing our hangar with a big fancy piece of equipment that was being provided by NASA, which was flying over Iran every day to go and have a look at some nuclear stuff or something of that order. And they told us that the other aircraft wasn't there. We certainly weren't meant to take its photo, and we weren't even meant to look at it. Well, in a couple of days of us coming in and out every day, they softened, and we were all friends at the end of it. So that was all fine. On the right there, you get the idea as to what happened every time we landed in most places, like Nagpur in central India. They didn't have quite the same facilities that you get in Dubai at ExecuJet. So you've always got like this bloke here with the red shirt on. He's your handler. It's important that some things are pre-organized. That may or may not include backhanders from some of the stories I've been told. What's important is that you pay this guy, which GASE took care of for us in advance, and all of that is smoothed over. So that's typically about $1,000. And then the fuel, which we're hand pumping in there to get into the aircraft, the avgas, which we've had to purchase by the barrel and get shipped over there, etc. That's another $1,000 every time we land. So the cost of fuel and handling and maintenance and all that becomes astronomical once you get away from the US, Europe, and Australia, I have to say. But hell, it was worth it, I tell you. Oh, he's filling it in the wrong place, says Tristan. Tristan, he's not filling it in the wrong place. Remember we said we put the ferry tank in. So we've got the fuel tanks in the wings as per normal, but where the back seats should be, we've got this, geez, what was it, 400 litres or something, big rubber bag that we're filling up so that we can get there with plenty of range. Yeah, take a balloon next time, Steve. Maybe we will. The wonderful thing, though, was not just the flying, it was meeting people on the ground. This is the Met Office in Nagpur. I couldn't interpret the charts in the tropics. It was confusing to me. The weather patterns are very different. So I went and saw the briefing team at the Nagpur Met Office. That led to us the next day diverting into Calcutta instead of going all the way to Chittagong in Bangladesh, because they'd warned us to look out for certain changes the next morning, which then did occur, which meant that we ended up landing in Calcutta in a thunderstorm, but not as bad as the thunderstorm we might have got to in Chittagong later that day. This young lady on the right here, this is Aparna Nair. She's a journalist with the Times of India who was introduced to us in Nagpur. She gave us a great half-page spread with photos, and that helped us raise money for Oxfam, which was cool. And then, guess what? She invited us back to meet her family. Her nephews there hadn't seen their city from the air, and we'd, of course, made video as we were landing, so we played that for them on the laptop, which was all just a wonderful experience for us. In Calcutta, the next day, we had quite an experience. One of the wonderful things about the airport in Calcutta is its name, by the way. It's called Dum Dum, which I giggled about for about an hour, I think. But once we landed at Dum Dum, after the thunderstorm, it was very hot, humid, sticky. We just wanted to get out of the plane. Well, some ground handlers ran up to us and they told us that we must not get out of the plane. They were under strict orders that we must stay in the aircraft until the boss came. And the boss is over here on the right. He's wearing the white uniform there. He's from Customs and Excise. And so we're thinking, gosh, you know, what have we done here? We're a domestic flight from one part of India to another. I don't know, maybe they're going to check us for guns and drugs or something. I don't know. Well, what had happened is that half-page story in the Times of India from the day before had been read, and these guys were pretty quick off the mark to get a photo, and they wanted us to assure them that we'd probably get that in the paper as well. It didn't really work out that way, but we were just delighted to have our photos taken with everyone anyway, so that was all good fun. over in Kuala Lumpur, we had an amazing experience. A guy called Captain Shiva, he's there on the right. He's not only a captain with Malaysian Airlines in those days, since moved on to one of the Middle East airlines, actually. But he spent a lot of time with youth organizations, training young engineers, training young pilots. And he got his young engineers to do our 50-hour service for us. And we did some flights around the Kuala Lumpur area with a TV crew, actually, in order to get some publicity. And that was all just amazing for us as we continued our way down through Southeast Asia. The photo on the left here, and I'm nearly done with the photos, guys. I know it's like looking at your granddad's holiday snaps, so I'll stop in a minute. But the guys on the left here, that's in Denpasar in Bali. And the Balinese, I've got to tell you, they're amazing, lovely, friendly people. And the reason we had this photo taken was because this was the first time in the whole journey, I think the only time, that someone brought us change. You have to carry cash. We had about 40,000 bucks of cash in US dollars strapped to our waists when we left Copenhagen. Because you need that for fuel, you need that for handling, you need that for all sorts of reasons. And can you imagine if your fuels come to $783 and you give them 1,000 that, you know, you don't always see all the change? Well, these guys, they brought the change out to us, and we were just so happy that we took their photo. The following day, we got to Kupang in West Timor, and it's mostly all men that come out to the aircraft. But this particular day, these two young ladies from the customs agency came out with them. And they were trying to catch our eye, and they were angling to get a photo taken. And I asked them why, and they said, "Oh, we've seen that you're on Facebook, so we want you to put our photos on Facebook." So that's what that was all about. And I just think it's a nice photo. We ended up in outback Australia, places like Longreach in central Queensland, which is where Qantas was started, the Queensland and Northern Territory Air Service. So that was exciting. That's us in Katherine in the Northern Territory, where we had that little issue with the spark plugs. To our amazement, on a Sunday when we landed there was these three blokes pulled up in a Cessna 182 at the same fuel pump. And when I asked them if they knew any engineers could help us with the spark plugs, they all put up their hands. They're a little business that flies out to cattle stations and does the maintenance on the helicopters and stuff. So within 45 minutes, we were airborne again with our plugs cleaned and changed, which is fantastic. We included visits to some of my extended family in the far north of Queensland, and the town where my grandmother was born is called Milla. And I don't know if you can see this collection of electric jugs at the back there. Now, this is the postmistress for Milla, and when I asked her about why she had all those jugs on the wall, she grabbed two of them and she held them to her chest, and she said what she probably says to every tourist who comes into that town. She says, "I've got the best jugs in Milla, mate." So that's why we took that photo there. Oh, hang on. Alan's got a question. Did you do any of your own maintenance? Did you carry any spares? And did you have any difficulty obtaining? Alan, it was a big consideration. We took all of our own spares for spark plugs, oil filters, fuel filters, air filters, that type of thing. We did need to have all that stuff with us because getting the parts is the hard part. Things like oil you can get anywhere. And I'm not skilled enough to do my own maintenance. I'm a bit all thumbs with mechanical things. But you can use US FAA certified engineers, and US certified engineers are basically everywhere in the world to do your maintenance for you. As long as the pilot in command and I'm licensed under the European regulations, you sign off each line item that they've done and certify that it's been done in accordance with the European standards. And my engineer in London showed me how to do that before we left. So that's a great question. Yeah, so we had lots of fun, as I said, in the outback, traveling around. We saw some magnificent thunderstorms. That monster there in Darwin, we could see that when we were halfway to Darwin from West Timor. It was about 50,000 feet tall, that anvil, and it scared the bejesus out of us. The little slightly smaller one on the right there happens to be sitting right over our destination airfield in Darwin. And all the airliners we could hear on the radio were getting diverted elsewhere. And happily, that thunderstorm cell just cleared the airfield before we had to land. We were doing the calculations to go to our alternate a couple of 100 miles inland if we had to, but I called up the controller And I said, look, we'd like to attempt an approach and see if we can land. He said, listen, mate, I can't even see the fence because the rain was so dense. I said, oh, okay. So we descended anyway, and we took ourselves about 20 miles downwind, and we were just about to climb back up and go to our alternate, having done our fuel calculations. We knew how much time we had. And I called him to say that we were going to continue on our way. And he called me back a minute later. He said, oh, listen, mate, I can see the fence now. So round we go, and then we were able to land, and then all the other airliners came in after us. So that was kind of cool. We saw some amazing sights. One of the great joys of traveling the world in a light aircraft is you see it. I've traveled back home to Australia over the last 30 years, 50 times at 30, 40,000 feet, and all you see is the movie. Whereas doing it this way, you get to see, smell, taste, and feel everything along the way. I'll never forget, for example, crossing the border from Bangladesh into Myanmar, Burma. We could almost smell the difference in the cooking styles as we came to the first mountain peak, and then the first high mountain village, which had only been 1,000 feet or so below us. And you could see how the culture changed because of the geography along the way. It was just absolutely fascinating. But then eventually we did make it to our goal, arriving in my hometown of Sydney. We did a lap of Sydney Harbour, the Sydney Harbour Scenic Route, they call it. You've got to get permission from the air traffic controllers at Sydney, whose major runway happens to align with this part of the sky just on the other side of the harbour bridge there. And initially, when I called them up using my Australian accent, they said, no, mate, we're busy. So what I did is I said, Sam, in your poshest British accent, could you call them back and explain that we've come all the way from London, which he did in a sort of British Airways style voice. And they said, oh, all right then. And they cleared us around the harbour. We got our photos, and we were just absolutely delighted to have completed the journey. Honestly, I would have liked for the journey to continue, but that wasn't one of the choices. And that's us just after we arrived in Sydney on that last leg there. A little side note here, Sam's then girlfriend Vicky had flown out to Sydney to meet us, and Sam had carried with him all the way from London a diamond ring. So when she was there, he jumped off the wing, got down on one knee and proposed marriage. All of my family who'd come to see me forgot about me and all just like burst into tears and clapping for that. And I just waited until that was all over. So Tristan, you've asked a good question there. How did you get Golf Yankee Sierra back to Blighty? Well, we took the wings off and we put it in a sea container. We had to get an engineer in Sydney to do that work for us. It's all got to be done in a certified fashion. And then that got shipped back to Denmark. The problem we had when we got it back to Denmark on the sea container some months later was that the Danish authorities wanted to charge me VAT on the aircraft until I could prove that it was already in circulation in Europe and that VAT wasn't applicable as an import. And we had no problem proving that. It just took about a week while they charged us an extra €100 a day to keep it in their port, which I thought was a bit of a rort. Who did the Oxfam paint job? Well, that's the aircraft's natural paint job, and that was a sticker. I organised transfers for various sponsors and for Oxfam themselves. That's a good question. Thank you, Michael. So that's about all we got, I think. A lot of people have asked us, would we do it again? And the answer is we absolutely would. I certainly would. But maybe next time I do it in something that burns Jet A, so a turbine engine, or perhaps even a twin. With hindsight, we had some engine issues and stuff like that, including in one particular piece of oceanic airspace in the Timor Sea that we managed to sort out. But in hindsight, I feel like we took just a little bit too much risk with this trip. But you know what? Without risk, there's no opportunity, and we just had a great experience, and we're very proud to have done this. So sorry for boring you for so long. I think I've gone a little bit over time, Tristan. I'm sorry about that. But I hope you guys found that of interest. Happy to take questions, or if you want to get on with the rest of your evening, I'm happy to bow out. So thank you very much for listening. Oh, Neil, you got a question there. November 9, November Lima. Would you say more about the Timor Sea engine? Yes, I can say more about that. I'll do that in a moment. Could you try doing it in a microlight that uses unleaded petrol? Alan, you could try doing it in a microlight, but gosh, I think you'd be brave. However, there is a very brave Englishman, two brave Englishmen actually, who've done that quite recently. I'll find a link to that. I've watched their journey on their YouTube. They finished year before last, around the world in 2 microlights. And that, honestly, that just amazes me that they did that. Was I a pilot in the Air Force, says Adrian, Golf Zero Echo Hotel Golf. No, I was not a pilot. I was an avionic engineer. I still work in IT related stuff, but I spent the longest time as a broadcast engineer and avionic engineer as well. What was the total cost? Lawrence, I can't possibly disclose the total cost because we're broadcasting this on YouTube, and my ex-wife might want the details. Great talk, thanks, Andy. I appreciate that, Lee. There was a question that I skipped. Yes, about the Timor Sea. Tristan, is it okay if I cover that story about the Timor Sea crossing? Have we got time?
Yeah, sure, that'd be brilliant. Thank you.
All right, mate. I'll just go to the relevant part of the map. Where are we? Here we go. Oh boy, where are we? There we go. Yeah, so this place here, Whiskey Alpha Tango Tango, would be Kupang in West Timor, I think. Or was it Whiskey Alpha Delta Delta? I'm not sure which one of those it was. Anyway, that crossing there doesn't look like much on this map, but that represents about, I think from memory, about 5.5 hours of flying over water. And West Timor, it's a pretty narrow, long, thin island. It's maybe 100, 200 miles long, but it's probably only 20 miles, 30 miles from one side of it to the other. And what happened when we landed there, we got the aircraft tied up, we did all the formalities, and we refueled. We pumped fuel into the aircraft in the usual way. And the next morning, one of the things that you do, it's a routine thing, is you use your fuel strainer to drain the tanks. And you're normally looking for water. Sometimes you get condensation in the fuel tank and it settles to the bottom. And you don't want water in your fuel lines when you're taking off. Otherwise, you know, you're gonna have the engine cough. So what we found to our horror this particular morning, in the starboard fuel tank, was that it was draining a combination of like rusty, sandy grit that was coming out of it mixed in with the fuel, not water at all. And we probably drained about 2 or 3 gallons out of that before it ran clear. And look, if we were here in this country, we'd have got an engineer to fully drain the tanks, and we would have got the lines flushed and all that. But that wasn't an option. In fact, the only barrel of avgas at that airport was the barrel that we'd ordered and had delivered there. So our choices were a bit stark. It was wait there for months possibly, or continue on our way. So what we decided to do, after a lot of ground testing and running the aircraft and putting the fuel transfer pumps in different configurations and so forth, the various fuel valves, we decided that we would take off and stay overhead the airfield while we did all those same tests under full load to make sure that we didn't see any issues with fuel flow. And we duly took off. We got into the overhead, and as we were climbing, you'd never normally do this as you climb, but I switched around the various fuel supplies and stuff, and it all just kept ticking along. So we looked at each other and we said, okay, well, let's keep going. We headed out into the Timor Sea, and when you're about an hour and a half out, you don't see anything really out there. It's just all blue. But we passed this, it looks like a oil platform. It's actually gas. It's an Australian concession that belongs to the East Timor continental shelf. And I just marked that in the GPS because you're always looking for ships that you can maybe glide to, and there wasn't a lot of shipping out there. In the Persian Gulf, there was always ships, so we could always see if the engine failed now, we'd glide over there or we'd glide over there. Whereas in this area, that was the only thing we'd seen. And about an hour after that, so we were just shy of our point of no return for the bit to Darwin, which is not exactly halfway. It's to do with what the wind is doing as well as the distance. The engine suddenly just coughed, and stopped firing for probably about 6 heartbeats. It wasn't for very long. It felt like a really long time, but it sort of coughed. We're trained, and we went through our drills. We changed the tank and flipped the fuel assist pump on and all of that. And while we're in the midst of all that, it just started up again. And you have enough time to feel the panic come up, because obviously you're in the middle of nowhere and you're probably not going to survive that. But then the important thing is, I've been through 1 or 2 aviation incidents. The important thing is that when you feel that feeling of panic come up, you push it away, because that's no use to you, and you just do what needs doing. And one of the things that I did in that very short amount of time is I selected the go-to on the GPS for that position I'd marked for the for the gas platform, which is by now about 80 miles behind us. And I remember thinking, as I started to plan a turn, I remember thinking, well, if that's 80 miles and we glide about 20 miles, and I could swim probably 2 or 3 miles, and I'm just getting to the point where I'm thinking, no, that's probably not going to work out. Well, before I finished that thought, the engine had started again. And Sam and I just looked at each other. We didn't say a word. I said, continue. He said, continue. And we did. And it was best just to focus on what we were doing. And we kept our eyes on the fuel flow meter and the engine gauges and stuff. But it wasn't until that evening at a pub on the main street in Darwin that I picked up a beer and noticed my hand was shaking. And I said, Jesus, Sam, are you all right? He says, no, mate, no, I'm not. So then we had a bit of a talk about it, because, adrenaline gets stored up and then it goes away. And that's when you're left with the reaction, happily, hours after the thing happened. Does that answer your question there? By the way, feel free to open your mics and ask questions if you want. I'll stop sharing for a minute so as I can see you all. Oh, there you all are. I can see you now. What was the longest continuous flight segment during the journey? I think I should have got the logbook out. I think that the longest continuous segment during the journey, Tristan, was I think it was 9.5 hours, and that was from Chittagong in Bangladesh. So that's Victor Golf Echo Golf, all the way to Victor Tango Bravo Delta, which is the old airport, the old international airport in Bangkok. You'll see in my plan, we plan to stop at Victor Yankee Yankee Yankee, which is Rangoon in Burma. But it turned out that we couldn't get avgas there, and there was no point stopping there because I would waste more fuel landing and then climbing out than I could really spare. We had, as I say, about 12 hours of fuel endurance, but you often needed 1 or 2 hours of additional fuel, because you have to have reserves for holding, you have to have reserves for contingency, you have to have reserves that let you get as far as your planned alternate. And in some places, like I remember in Pakistan, the nearest alternate was about 200 miles away that we could legally and safely use. So we have to have a lot more fuel than we had actual flight time planned. Does that make sense, Tristan? Cool.
Yeah, brilliant. 9.5 hours seems like an awful long time to fly shoulder to shoulder with your fellow pilots. The aeroplane I used to have a part sharing was Garvu, which is a Piper Cherokee PA-160, and we were literally shoulder to shoulder to each other. So did you kind of feel a lack of privacy in a way?
Sam and I have known each other for a very, very long time. I wish he could have been here tonight. He'd have enjoyed this, but he's busy with something else tonight. We still work together now. Look, my requirements when I selected someone to come on this journey with me, they had to be a really good pilot. I mean, Sam's also an instructor these days. He's an exceptional pilot. They had to weigh less than 70 kilos, partly because I weigh considerably more than 70 kilos, and weight and balance is an important factor, as you'll know. I also reckoned he'd make good desert rations, because I reckoned I could catch him if we crashed. But most importantly, it had to be someone that could sit next to me for 12 hours a day for 2 months and take my shit, and vice versa, quite frankly. And yeah, honestly, we had a blast. We had such a fun time, and the heavy metal music was pretty awesome. We got a few videos of that. If anyone's keen, I can send links to all the in-flight videos. We've got dozens of them of various landings and things along the way. And there's one or two where we're, I think, in the middle of the Persian Gulf is one of them actually, where we're singing System of a Down songs. And we can hear the music in our heads, but the recording, you can only hear us. So it's pretty poor. But that's how we kept ourselves entertained. There is quite a lot of stuff that you have to do when you're en route, navigation and checking your fuel consumption in particular, your timing for your alternate. We had to divert hundreds and hundreds of miles over Egypt one day because of some pop-up military activity over the Sinai Peninsula. So there's often things that you have to do. So you're busy, but you're not busy all the time. And so in those times in between, we'd have a chat, we'd listen to music, but mostly we would just marvel at the outside world and the views and the privileged view of the world that we had from that relatively low height. That's how we kept ourselves in it. Oh, that and a bit of ham radio as well, as I touched on before. Sam wasn't at all interested in the ham radio, I have to say.
I've asked Pat to unmute himself because I know he'll have a really good question for you, Andy.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, well, in this country, as you well know, we have a tune that's played before weather forecasts called Sailing By. And I'm just wondering if there's an aeronautical equivalent to that.
Oh, geez. No, the one that we mostly listened to was Rammstein, Du hast. Any other heavy metal fans here? We mostly sang and listened to that sort of thing as we went along, and quite a lot of AC/DC, I have to say. What would be the aviation equivalent of that? You've only got, I think aviation doesn't do well in music. You've got crap stuff like Magnificent Men and Their Flying Machines, haven't you? Nothing that's really good.
Oh yeah, what about Wagner? What about the Ride of the Valkyries? That's
Valkyries. Now I studied classical music at school. I should have thought of that, Pat. You're spot on.
What about Here We Go Into the Deep Blue Yonder?
Here we go into the deep blue. That's not bad. You guys are good.
That's the American Air Force. It was during World War II.
What did we have in the Australian Air Force? We had probably the same tunes you have in the military here, I think. I can't bring any to mind. Good question.
Waltzing Matilda.
Well, it wasn't God Save the Queen, I'll tell you that much.
You didn't mention anything about wind drift at all. Were you pushed off course at any point?
Look, the whole time when you're flying, the same as when you're sailing, if any of you are sailors, you're always dealing with the drift. With the electronic navigation aids, you can pretty quickly sort out your heading. You initially fly to what you've planned for the wind drift, but the wind, especially at altitude, and especially when you're going very long distances, changes a lot in the course of the flight. It also changes a lot compared to what's been forecast in most cases. And so you've got to fairly continually reassess the drift and make sure that your tracking as opposed to heading is keeping you going to where you want to go. The bigger challenge with all that, though, is the impact of the headwind component on your fuel endurance. There's a lot that you can control regarding the altitude that you select, the relative air density, the power settings in the aircraft. There's all sorts of tables and charts we've got with the engine and performance management stuff that we seek to optimize. But having planned as best you can, we did on a couple of the longer legs find that during the climb phase of the flight, we were getting forecast fuel consumption of more than we had to get us that we needed to get to our destination. So what we had to do in those cases was then get into the cruise, let it all settle down, and then try to optimize the leaning and the performance tweaks on the engine settings as best we could. And then we'd anxiously watch for the forecast on the fuel flow meter for the forecast landing fuel to go back above our reserves. And the biggest variable for all of that was the actual headwind on the day. we could subsequently calculate that and reconfirm that it was all going to get us there. But we had to do all that before we got to the point of no return, so that we could turn back if we, if it had all gone Pete Tom, which was certainly one of the options. There was, I think it was Dubai to Karachi where I had the biggest concern, because I had plenty of alternates off to my left, but that was in Iran. We'd have landed, we'd have been okay physically, but like it would have complicated our lives horrendously had we had to take that option. So that's where we had the most focus on that, Tristan, if that makes sense.
Thank you, Malcolm.
Ashley's tea's ready, so Ashley better go and get a tea. Paul, good luck with the dog. Lee, best DX. Good question. The best DX was the most fun DX, a guy that called us every day from Central India until we passed Indonesia. Now, I forget his name and call sign now, but he was in Java, and he wanted to tell us the weather in Jakarta, because he imagined, I think, that he was probably our best source of information about the weather in Jakarta as we were flying along. So he had the whole village in there at one point calling us back and making sure that we had that little piece of information, as I recall. So that was the most fun DX, I'd say.
Andy, with all that fuel on board, you must have quite a bit of vapour in the cabin.
Yeah.
So how did you go on with all the electrical equipment?
Yeah, well, having worked in the Air Force for a long time, I sort of love that smell, the fumes. But first of all, no smoking in the aircraft, obviously. To be fair, the fuel tank that we had, if you Google it, it's called a turtle pack. One word, turtle, and then PAC. It's actually an Australian company out of Queensland. And one of the big advantages of that type of ferry tank compared to the usual aluminium sort is that they are sealed, and the bag actually collapses as you use fuel out of it. Whereas with the aluminium sort, they have to breathe. There has to be a breather tube for the air pressure. And of course, as you're changing altitude, that sucks out as well as blows, and you do fill the cabin with fumes. So I'd be lying if I said you couldn't smell it. You could, but it wasn't an issue. All the electrics, one of the reasons you get certified every year on your radio annual is also to make sure that there's nothing sparking and untoward and all of that. But look, Lawrence, I'd say that all of these risks you can manage, but none of them can you eliminate. The same as the risk of ditching in the ocean, for example. So ultimately, in an aircraft which doesn't have redundant systems, which has fuel in the seats, you either decide you're going to go and then minimize the risks as best you can, or you decide you're not going to go at all, if that makes sense.
Well, thank you, Andy. Do anybody else have any questions?
Pat here. I'd just like to thank Andy. That was an absolutely awesome presentation.
Oh, good on you.
I've got to go along with that.
Thank you very much, chaps. Appreciate that.
Yeah, it was well worth the waiting for. It was absolutely superb.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. I'm sorry I went on for so long. I've eaten into all your time tonight.
It just makes the drink even more appreciative when we get to it.
Oh yes, I've got something cold in the fridge waiting for me. But so on behalf of Barrier Radio Society, and I hope I speak for Warrington Amateur Radio Club as well,
and Werribee Amateur Radio Society.
Oh yes, and Werribee as well, and everybody in Australia watching. Thank you ever so much, and it's been fantastic hearing about your adventure with Sam, going from Blighty to Oz. So round of applause, everybody.
Nice one.
Thanks so much. Look, 73, everyone, and I hope to catch some of you on 80 or 40 or top band. I do very slow, very poor hand Morse. So if any of you are into that sort of thing, drop me a note. I'd be happy to organise a sked.
Oh, you're among friends here with slow Morse.
Oh, you are.
Pat, you've got the